Robert Christgau was the most feared music critic in America. They called him the Dean of American rock critics. When he wrote a review, careers could end. Albums could disappear from record store shelves. Artists would cancel tours. His word was law in the music industry, and everyone knew it. In March 1968, Christgau published what would become one of the most controversial reviews of his career. 3 paragraphs. Brutal, clinical, dismissive. The album was Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix. The review was a massacre. Christgau had spent 3 days with the album, playing it on his high-end stereo system, taking notes, dissecting each track with the precision of a surgeon. He'd listened to Purple Haze and heard only distortion. He'd played Hey Joe and found it derivative. The Wind Cries Mary struck him as pretentious nonsense wrapped in studio effects. Noise masquerading as innovation, Christgau wrote. Hendrix mistakes volume for virtuosity, feedback for feeling. This is not music. This is sonic chaos dressed up for the masses who wouldn't know real artistry if it played Carnegie Hall. The guitar work lacks the sophistication of jazz, the emotional honesty of blues, the structural integrity of classical composition. What we have here is a performer who confuses loudness with intensity, spectacle with substance. The review continued for another paragraph, methodically dismantling each track. Christgau compared Hendrix unfavorably to Eric Clapton, B.B. King, and classical guitarists like Julian Bream. He questioned the musicianship, the songwriting, even the production values. By the end, he'd reduced the album to what he saw as its core truth: manufactured rebellion for suburban teenagers with too much allowance money. The review ran in the Village Voice on a Thursday morning. By noon, it was being quoted on radio shows. Within hours, it was being reprinted in newspapers across the country. Music industry executives were calling their assistants, asking for copies. Record store owners were fielding questions from confused customers. Christgau's disciples in music journalism nodded in agreement, some already working on their own negative reviews. The establishment had spoken. Jimi Hendrix was a fraud. But that was March. By October, something had changed. Are You Experienced was climbing the charts despite Christgau's assassination attempt. Radio stations that had initially ignored the album were getting requests. Young musicians were buying Stratocasters. The underground was becoming overground, and Robert Christgau was starting to wonder if he'd made a mistake. October 15, 1968, the Fillmore East. Jimi Hendrix was headlining, and Christgau had been assigned to cover the show. Not by choice. His editor at the Village Voice wanted a follow-up piece, something that would either confirm his original review or allow him to admit error gracefully. Christgau preferred the former. He arrived at the venue early, press credentials around his neck, notebook in hand. The Fillmore was packed, nearly 3,000 people. Most of them young, most of them white, most of them middle-class kids from the suburbs who thought they understood rebellion. Christgau surveyed the crowd with the detached amusement of someone who'd seen this scene play out dozens of times. Another guitar hero, another fad, another disappointment waiting to happen. Backstage, Christgau waited in the small press area, a converted dressing room with folding chairs and harsh fluorescent lighting. The walls were covered in band stickers and graffiti, layers of rock history accumulated over months of touring acts. Someone had written "Clapton is God" in black marker near the door, but it was already fading, looking dated in a world where new guitar heroes emerged every month. Other journalists milled around, some he recognized from Rolling Stone, others from smaller publications. A photographer from Life magazine sat in the corner, checking his camera equipment. A reporter from Melody Maker was interviewing a roadie about the technical setup. Everyone was talking about Hendrix, about his wild performances, his theatrics, his supposed genius. Christgau listened and took notes, already forming his second review in his head. He'd seen this scene play out dozens of times before. The hype machine at work, journalists feeding off each other's enthusiasm, creating consensus around the latest sensation. Most of them were younger than him, less experienced, more easily impressed by volume and spectacle. They'd write breathless reviews about revolutionary guitar work, and 6 months later, they'd be writing the same reviews about the next electric blues guitarist to arrive from Chicago or Detroit. A thin man with long hair and wire-rimmed glasses approached him. "You're Kreisgau, right? From the voice?" Kreisgau nodded. "I read your Hendrix review. Tough but fair. Someone needed to say it." The man extended his hand. "Dave Marsh, Cream Magazine. I've been thinking the same thing. All flash, no substance." Before Kreisgau could respond, the room got quieter. A few journalists were looking toward the hallway, whispering. Someone important was coming. At 9:30, a roadie appeared, a black man in his 30s with paint-stained jeans and a Fillmore East t-shirt. He scanned the room until his eyes found Kreisgau. "Mr. Kreisgau, Jimmy can see you now," he said, his voice carrying just the slightest hint of challenge, as if he'd read the review too and wasn't impressed. The other journalists looked up, curious. Everyone wanted FaceTime with Hendrix, but interviews were rare, especially one-on-one sessions. Kreisgau felt the weight of their attention as he gathered his notebook and pen. This was his territory, his expertise, the interview, the place where he could cut through hype and image to find the truth underneath. Jimmy was sitting on a couch, his white Stratocaster on his lap, not plugged in. He was wearing a purple shirt, beads around his neck, his hair a perfect afro. He looked up when Kreisgau entered, smiled slightly, and gestured to a chair across from him. "Mr. Kreisgau," Jimmy said, his voice softer than Kreisgau had expected. "Thank you for coming." Kreisgau sat down, opened his notebook, clicked his pen. This was his domain. The interview, the interrogation, the place where he could expose the gap between image and substance, between hype and talent. "I read your review," Jimmy said before Kreisgau could ask his first question. The room got quiet, not silent, because they could hear the opening band playing in the distance, the muffled sound of drums and bass coming through the walls. But quiet in the way that rooms get when something important is about to happen. Kreisgau waited. In his experience, artists either got defensive when confronted with negative reviews, or they tried to charm their way out of the criticism. Either response would give him material for his follow-up piece. But Jimmy didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain his music or justify his approach. He just sat there holding his unplugged guitar, looking at Kreisgau with curious eyes. "What did you think of it?" Jimmy asked finally. "The review?" Kreisgau said. "I stand by every word." "No," Jimmy said quietly. "The music. What did you think of the music?" It was a simple question, but something about the way Jimmy asked it made Kreisgau pause. There was no challenge in his voice, no anger, no wounded ego, just genuine curiosity, as if he really wanted to understand Kreisgau's perspective. "I think," Kreisgau said carefully, "that you're confusing noise with innovation, volume with virtuosity. I think you're playing to the lowest common denominator, giving people spectacle instead of substance." Jimmy nodded slowly as if considering this. "What would you consider substance?" "Real musicianship," Kreisgau replied, his confidence returning. "Technical skill married to emotional depth. Complex arrangements that serve the song, not the ego. Artists like Bach, Beethoven, Miles Davis, Bob Dylan. Musicians who understand that less is often more." "Bach," Jimmy repeated. "You like Bach?" "Of course," Kreisgau said. "The Brandenburg Concertos, the well-tempered clavier. That's composition, that's structure, that's what music should be." Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers moving absently on the unplugged strings of his Stratocaster. Kreisgau could barely hear the movement, just the faint scratch of fingertips on metal. "Can I show you something?" Jimmy asked. Before Kreisgau could respond, Jimmy was standing up, walking to a small amplifier in the corner of the room. A practice amp, tiny compared to the Marshall stacks on stage, but loud enough for the small space. He plugged in his Stratocaster, adjusted the volume to a whisper, and sat back down. "Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, Jimmy said. "First movement. You know it?" Kreisgau nodded. He'd been listening to classical music since he was 12, had studied composition in college. Of course he knew it. Jimmy's fingers found the fretboard, and suddenly that small dressing room was filled with Bach, but not Bach as Kreisgau had ever heard it before. Jimmy was playing the harpsichord part on electric guitar, his fingers dancing across the strings with impossible precision, creating the intricate counterpoint that made Bach so brilliant. But it wasn't just note perfect. It was interpretive, personal, alive in a way that classical recordings rarely achieved. Kreisgau's pen stopped moving. His notebook lay forgotten in his lap. He'd heard this piece hundreds of times on recordings in concert halls, on his own piano at home, but he'd never heard it like this. Jimi was making the electric guitar sound like a whole orchestra, bass lines and melody lines weaving together, harmony and counterpoint emerging from 6 strings and 10 fingers. The technique was flawless, every note clear, every phrase shaped, every dynamic change executed with surgical precision. But more than that, it was musical. Jimi wasn't showing off his guitar skills. He was serving the composition, honoring Bach's genius while somehow making it his own. And he was doing it on the same instrument Christgau had dismissed as noise-making equipment. After about 2 minutes, Jimi stopped. The silence that followed was profound. Christgau realized he'd been holding his breath. The fluorescent light hummed above them. In the distance, roadies were setting up equipment, voices calling out technical instructions. But in that small room, time had stopped. Christgau's world had shifted on its axis, and he wasn't sure how to process what had just happened. He'd spent his entire career building frameworks for understanding music, categories for sorting good from bad, real from fake, important from trivial. Bach was serious music. Electric guitar was entertainment. Classical training was legitimate. Self-taught rock musicians were amateurs playing dress-up. These weren't just opinions. They were fundamental truths that shaped how he heard everything. In 2 minutes, Jimi had demolished those frameworks completely. That was, Christgau started, then stopped. He couldn't find words. His mouth felt dry. His hands, usually steady when taking notes, were trembling slightly. In 30 seconds, Jimi had destroyed every assumption Christgau had made about his musical abilities, his artistic seriousness, his understanding of composition and structure. But it was more than that. Christgau was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, genuine surprise. When was the last time a musician had actually shocked him? When had anyone shown him something he didn't know existed? "I learned that when I was 15, Jimi said quietly, his voice cutting through Christgau's internal chaos. Used to play it on acoustic guitar, trying to figure out how Bach thought, how he built those melodies. Took me months to get it right." 15. Christgau had been studying classical music since he was 12, had taken formal lessons, had attended concerts at Lincoln Center, had read every music theory book in the Columbia University Library, and here was someone who had figured out Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 on his own, at 15, on acoustic guitar, with no formal training. Christgau stared at him, his journalistic instincts finally kicking in. "You can read music?" "Had to," Jimi said with a slight smile. "How else would I learn Bach? Beethoven? Handel? I studied them all. Not formally, but I studied them. The electric guitar stuff, the feedback, the volume, that's just one color on the palette. But you have to understand the fundamentals first." The room was quiet again. In the distance, the opening band had finished their set. Soon Jimi would have to go on stage and become the wild man of rock and roll, the guitar-burning showman who played with his teeth and behind his head. But here, in this small room, he was something else entirely. A serious musician, a student of music history, an artist who understood both tradition and innovation. "Why don't you play like that on your albums?" Christgau asked. "Because that's not what that music needs," Jimi replied. "Purple Haze isn't trying to be Brandenburg Concerto. It's trying to be Purple Haze. Different songs need different approaches. Sometimes you need Bach's precision. Sometimes you need Chuck Berry's wildness. Sometimes you need something that doesn't exist yet, so you have to invent it." Christgau looked down at his notebook, at the questions he'd prepared, the angle he'd planned for his follow-up review. All of it seemed suddenly irrelevant. "The feedback," Christgau said slowly, "the distortion, you're doing that on purpose." "Of course," Jimi said. "Feedback is just another voice, another instrument. You have to learn to control it, to make it say what you want it to say. Same with distortion. It's not about being loud for the sake of being loud. It's about texture, about emotional color." A roadie knocked on the door. "5 minutes, Jimi." Jimi nodded, unplugged his guitar, started gathering his things. The interview was over, but Kreisgau felt like it had just begun. Everything he thought he knew about this artist, about electric guitar, about the relationship between technique and expression, had been called into question. "Mr. Kreisgau," Jimmy said as he headed toward the door, "I hope you enjoy the show tonight, and I hope you'll listen to the album again, maybe with different ears." Then he was gone, leaving Kreisgau alone in the small room with his useless notebook and his shattered assumptions. The show that night was a revelation. Kreisgau watched from the press section, seeing everything with new eyes. The wildness was still there, the theatrics, the volume. But underneath it all, he could now hear the musicianship, the structure, the careful construction of every song. Jimmy wasn't just making noise. He was composing in real time, creating sonic landscapes that served the emotional content of each piece. When Jimmy played the solo and All Along the Watchtower, Kreisgau heard Bach's influence in the way the melodic lines connected. When he used feedback during Purple Haze, Kreisgau understood it was intentional, controlled, musical. The guitar burning at the end wasn't just shock value, it was theater, spectacle in service of art. Kreisgau never wrote the follow-up review. He couldn't. How do you explain that you were wrong about everything? How do you admit that your expertise, your critical authority, your whole professional identity was built on assumptions that a 25-year-old guitarist had demolished in 2 minutes? Instead, he started listening. Really listening. To Hendrix, yes, but also to other artists he'd dismissed, other sounds he'd been too quick to judge. He began to understand that his role as a critic wasn't to enforce musical orthodoxy, but to help readers discover the artistry in forms they might not initially understand. Years later, in 1987, Rolling Stone published a retrospective on influential albums of the 1960s. Kreisgau was asked to contribute an essay on Are You Experienced? He wrote, "I was wrong. Not just wrong about the album, but wrong about what music could be, about where innovation comes from, about the relationship between tradition and revolution." Jimi Hendrix didn't reject musical fundamentals. He absorbed them completely, then used them as a launching pad for something entirely new. I mistook his departure from convention for ignorance of convention. I confused unfamiliarity with incompetence. Are You Experienced isn't noise masquerading as innovation. It's innovation built on a foundation of complete musical understanding. I should have known better. I should have listened better. The essay became one of the most widely quoted pieces of music criticism ever published. Not because it praised Hendrix, but because it showed how even expert listeners could miss greatness when it arrived in unfamiliar packaging. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Kreisgau was asked to write his obituary for the Village Voice. Instead of the usual biographical summary, he wrote a single paragraph. "Jimi Hendrix taught me that the job of an artist is not to meet your expectations, but to expand your definition of what's possible. He taught me that volume and virtuosity are not opposites, that innovation and tradition can coexist, that sometimes the most profound music comes disguised as entertainment. He taught me to listen with my heart as well as my head." I was privileged to learn from him, even though I was too slow to recognize the teacher. The backstage meeting between Kreisgau and Hendrix lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it changed how one of America's most influential critics thought about music, about judgment, about the danger of dismissing what you don't immediately understand. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the people you're trying to teach,